Welcome to the 1110 Leadership Podcast, where we tackle issues at the intersection of leadership, faith, and culture. I'm your host, Rob Shields, Vice President of Strategy at 1110 Leadership, and I'm joined by my co-host, founder and CEO of 1110 Leadership, David Spickard. Proverbs 1110 lays out a bold and countercultural vision. When the righteous prosper, the city rejoices. We're here to ask, what does it look like practically to be this type of leader? Leaders willing to invest everything they have so that everyone around them can thrive. Join us on the journey as we lean in, listen, and learn how to become Proverbs 11:10 kind of leaders. The kind of leaders that make our cities rejoice. David.
Hey, Rob.
How are we doing, my friend?
I'm doing well today.
You got your Tar Heel gear on.
I do. I'm decked out.
You're decked out. You ready for football season?
As I looked in my closet or my drawer, all these just came together. So I've got my hat, my shirt, and my shorts now.
I love it. The coordination is on point. On point. We got a lot of factors going on in today's podcast. We're recording this in the backdrop of a big storm. So who knows? We're just kind of venturing out and just hoping that the lights stay on for us.
Yep.
I've got my candle burning to give me light no matter what.
Okay,
so
I can do this in the dark if I have to.
That's great. You're a pro. You could do this blindfolded. You don't need to see me. It might actually help you focus more if you don't. That's great. Well, I am looking forward to today's conversation. I think it's a really important one as we continue to journey on unpacking the various issues around cultural competency. So we've covered a lot of ground so far. Just a general overview of what cultural competent leaders look like, then starting to work through issues like race, poverty, and now, which leads us to having a really meaningful conversation around what does it mean to be culturally competent around sexuality and gender. So before I start our conversation and I kind of tee you up to lead us through your thoughts, just wanted to help frame up with a few stats to kind of have in the background for today. I know folks are coming at this from all different perspectives and lived experiences, but hopefully this will kind of be a little bit of a level set. Some stats here specifically around sexual orientation and in general, and then also what does this look like in the workplace? People identifying as LGBTQ plus have more than doubled in the last 10 years. So in 2012, when Gallup first began measuring LGBTQ plus identification, 3.5% of U.S. adults identified as LGBTQ plus. By 2021, that percentage had gone to over 7%. The trans population has also doubled in the last 10 years and has, as we started to measure, including teenage population there of people 13 and older. Boston Consulting Group, when it comes to thinking about this in the context of work, which is a leadership podcast, they did an interesting study on workplace inclusion for the LGBTQ plus community, and a couple of stats that are really helpful here. 40% of LGBTQ plus employees don't feel comfortable about being open about their orientation or gender identity at work. 75% report experiencing negative day-to-day workplace interactions related to their identity in the past year. And Deloitte did a similar study on inclusion in 2021 that showed that 61% of the LGBTQ plus respondents said they're more likely to stay at their current organization if they feel supported. So these are helpful statistics, I think, for today's conversation. There's a lot going on here. And so just wanted to have that to frame up today. But David, you wrote a whole chapter in your book on this issue. Can you just walk us through your own personal journey and how you've thought about both experiencing this issue personally, but then also just your process of writing this chapter and kind of what you were going for in including this on a book on just leadership?
Yeah, well, this was a challenging chapter to write. It was actually something I added toward the end, primarily because many of the leaders that we work with were dealing with these issues more regularly in their workplace and decisions around how they care for people in their companies who are LGBTQ plus, and how do they navigate that based on their beliefs and how they want to create an environment where all of their employees can thrive, no matter their backgrounds, no matter their beliefs. So it became very apparent if we were going to talk about what it means to be just and be relevant for our current world, I needed to add this chapter and provide some framework. And, for me, this is just an area of real growth. I mean, I don't come at this at all from a place of expertise. This is something that I'm myself growing in. And I decided, it's such a nuanced conversation, and, it's also emotionally charged in many ways. People are very passionate about the way they feel about sexual orientation and gender identity issues. And there's also a lot of disagreement, even within the church. There's different beliefs about what's right and what's wrong related to these issues. So, my goal in the chapter was not to take a stand or how we should believe about these things, although that's very important. And for those of us, people of faith, we take our cues from the Bible in terms of how we think about gender identity and sexual orientation. My purpose in this was to help us understand what posture we should have, and that how do we create authentic relationship within our organizations so that people feel like they belong. And we can do that across difference. And so my framing question for my chapter is, how do we as leaders approach gender and sexuality well, knowing that the people we're leading have strong and often contradictory convictions? So most of our
Love that.
leaders that we work with are leading in a context where no matter what they believe, they are leading a group of people who believe differently from one another, where it's a contentious issue. And they have to know how to lead those groups of people well in order for people to feel valued and people to feel like they belong, but also people to feel like they can disagree and come at this from different perspectives and that still be okay. And I think in our culture, we may not experience that. We may not know how to do that. And so we've got to then figure out what kind of posture we have to have if we want to achieve that in our companies.
I think that's such a refreshing way to go about this, because it feels like a different conversation that's what's normal, and also helps separate it, because we, both you and I are coming at all of this through the lens of what does Christian scripture say about being just and living a just life, specifically though within the context of business leadership. And so this is where we wear multiple hats and identities ourselves, even of like the way that their churches, Christian churches, split over this very issue all the time, because they're like, if you don't believe the same thing I believe, I'm out. I'm going to go to somewhere that believes exactly what I believe. And if leadership is saying this, then I'm assuming that most people are on board with this very specific conviction here. This is a different conversation. Like, that framing question puts this in a category of, we can't assume business contexts don't function that way. And so there's this question that Christian business leaders have to be asking if they want to be just, because they can't operate that same way that you might in other aspects of your life outside of work. So I'm looking forward to this. I hope that our listeners are energized by the framing of that, whether they've read the chapter or not. Obviously would encourage everyone to pick the book up, because you go into so much more detail in the chapter. Not to say that you answer all the questions in the chapter, because I don't think that there are easy answers, honestly, but you ask a lot of really good questions that invite us to thoughtful self-examination. So I'd love to just kind of keep peeling the onion back a little bit, David. So with that framing question, how do we as leaders approach this issue well, knowing that there is going to be difference in our business context and there will be contradictory convictions in the workplace? So what does justice and cultural competency look like, and how do leaders go about answering those questions?
Well, first, it starts with us, and for us to have a high level of self-awareness and thoughtfulness. Again, we need to understand where we stand on these issues ourselves and what directs us in those convictions. And then how do we engage people who may believe differently? And that's centered on us understanding that all of us are made in God's image and that we should uphold the value of all of us, no matter how we view these issues. And so we can approach people with whom we may believe differently, or again, our groups that are coming at this from various different perspectives, to demonstrate clearly everyone's value. And then figure out how we can create a context where there can be disagreement, or if a leader needs to make a decision because they don't want to go against their own convictions, they can do so knowing that they've created that value with their employees, so that that's not a question as to whether that leader values their employees, no matter the decisions that they're having to make. And that's hard to do. I mean, leaders might be misunderstood with that. They might be considered that they don't value their employees. So it's really important that they're cognizant of how to do that and to do that well. So every business has the ability to decide what they want to do or how they feel about this issue, particularly privately held businesses. And if they do, they just have to realize that not everyone is going to feel the same way, and particularly their employees who come from different perspectives. And so they just need to be ready for that.
David, in the chapter, you talk about this dichotomy between disagreement around issues of sexual identity and orientation and acceptance. Can you unpack that a little bit more for our listeners, like you do in the chapter?
So there's a real nuance with this related to the idea of affirmation and acceptance, and that a lot of folks believe that if you disagree with me, then you are not affirming or accepting me and my value, because I see my sexual orientation or my gender identity as my identity. And therefore, if you disagree, then that idea of affirmation and acceptance are combined. And I'm having to affirm your behavior in order to accept you. But there are many who, would not necessarily affirm that as being someone's identity, and yet they accept them. They accept their value, and they want to create a sense that I can disagree with how you view that, but I want to be very clear in how I connect with you so that you feel accepted and valuable. And that could be really missed. This is a dynamic where, crossing culture, like, it's different than even crossing race and other differences because of that nuance between affirmation and acceptance. And so it's really important as leaders that we understand that difference. This happens on a case-by-case basis where, we're engaging people individually and we may be misunderstood initially. But as long as we are upfront and we communicate well, we can navigate this with them in ways that ultimately build trust.
Yeah, there's so many layers to this conversation, and this is where we always talk about that first quality, seeing the whole playing field, is one that you never really graduate from, but it kind of sets a tone for the rest of the qualities. I think that's especially true here. I think about, even we dedicated a whole podcast episode to being emotionally intelligent as just leaders. I think that's really relevant to this conversation, because even as you're talking, David, I can picture a leader being really thoughtful and really intentional and still might not deliver the result you want of guaranteeing your people feel accepted, because at the end of the day, relationships are two-way streets, and acknowledging, again, back to seeing their story and knowing their story didn't start the day that they started working for you. And there's a lot of nuance and a lot of hurt in people's stories and misunderstanding in people's stories when it comes to this issue, because of how these convictions usually get expressed, not well, poorly. And I think that's also just really worth acknowledging in this conversation, is like, we need to acknowledge that their relationship doesn't exist in a vacuum and isn't siloed, and you can't extract it from just a really complicated web of relationship and story that you inherit as a leader when your people walk in the door. And so knowing that, which is why we talk about how important it is to get to know our people's stories, to be able to shape how we empathize with them, and it will affect how we lead them.
Yeah, and I think, we'll all make mistakes. I think we said this in earlier episodes around cultural competency. We'll make mistakes with what we say. We will make mistakes in our posture. I know I have. But hopefully, if we've done, again, what we've talked about, which is move toward people and highlight value and recognize that we're all on a journey and we hear each other's stories, then we can navigate this even when it's messy.
I love that, David. You take it to value and dignity, because as just leaders, where we can be different in this conversation is being just as clear, if not more clear, about what we're for than what we're against. And it feels like where really this conversation can go sideways is when we, as leaders, or just even as people of faith, can be more clear, if not the only thing we care about clarity on is making sure people know what we're against. And what you're saying is you're providing a list of what we should be for. And those two things, I think, are really important. There's another side to this conversation, and that's where you're taking this.
Yeah.
In the chapter, you talk about really turning the volume up more on what speaks value to your people than about making a public statement. In certain cases where that may be the framing of, hey, what are you going to tweet about on X, Y, and Z issue? You're saying, hey, there's a time and place maybe for that. But doing the internal work of communicating acceptance and value to your people, that really almost takes the air out of the balloon of the pressure of, I got to send that tweet out. Because if everything hinges on a tweet, you're really in trouble. If that's what your people are waiting for, because you haven't done a good job of consistently expressing that they matter.
That's right.
And that you've leaned in. I think it's really wise and encouraging that that's where you took that in this chapter.
And usually those things are more reactive things that we do than proactive.
Yep. And we talked about that with the issue of race too. Like, honestly, this isn't the only issue where being proactive is really important when it comes to issues of cultural competence. So, David, what questions should business leaders be asking themselves to ensure that they are proactively working on this?
Yeah, so here's some questions that we can ask ourselves. How do we create a culture of belonging for those in the LGBTQ plus community? Who do we need to learn from to become more culturally competent in our leadership in this area? And then how does Jesus' posture of grace and truth challenge you? And I talk about this in the book, this idea of grace and truth, both and. It's okay to stay true to conviction and not cross lines you're not comfortable with based on what you believe to be true around these issues. But you have to do that with grace as well. So which area do you need to grow in? Are you more of a truth person? So you need to add more grace, or are you a grace person and you need to add more truth? And what could that look like practically? There's a lot we could talk about related to this, but in my book, I give a whole chapter around how Jesus models this as a culturally competent leader through the story of him at Jacob's well with the Samaritan woman. It's a well-known story in the Bible. And as we walk through that story, we go through that story with our groups. We have identified 10 principles that Jesus demonstrates that shows how to be a culturally competent leader, which has tremendous application for issues around sexual orientation and gender identity, but also the other areas that we've talked about, poverty, race, and even certainly other divides that we might have. And just to recount the story, Jesus was with his disciples. The text said he was in Judea and he had to go through Samaria to get to Galilee, which was very unusual because most Jews, in fact, all Jews, went around Samaria to get from Judea to Galilee because Jews hated Samaritans. They considered them half-breeds. If they interacted with them, they felt like they would become unclean. And yet Jesus was intentional, and he went through Samaria, and he got thirsty and tired, and he ended up at Jacob's well at noon, right in the middle of the day. The disciples left, went into town, and Jesus was left with a Samaritan woman, where he ends up having this unique interaction with her to ask her for a drink, to engage with her around a conversation about the coming Messiah and about him then revealing himself to her as that Messiah. And then eventually she became the agent through which the gospel was spread in Samaria and to the ends of the earth. But what's amazing is that this was like a water cooler conversation. It was just a small one-on-one conversation across cultural lines where Jesus was intentional. He acknowledged her value. He demonstrated what it looked like to give power away to her. He built trust with her. He spoke truth to her. He even called out the ways in which she was living at that time in sin, and he pointed that out to her. But he didn't do it with a hammer. He did it with grace. And as a result of that, she responded and knew that he was the one who would give her life and ultimately be the way in which she would never thirst again. So I write about these 10 principles in the book as a framework for us in this conversation as we're crossing lines related to sexual orientation and gender identity. And they apply to crossing lines related to diversity and race, as well as poverty and other cultural lines. These issues can be paralyzing for us to consider as we think about what it means to be culturally competent. It can be very confusing, it can be very frustrating, and they certainly can be divisive, and we may not know what to do. But it starts small. It starts with one person. It starts with things that a lot of people don't see, and being faithful to walking with people next to us, learning their stories, engaging with them, believing and demonstrating their value, and then navigating hard, difficult, nuanced conversations that, again, help us build trust and ultimately create a sense of belonging that helps everyone win.
You know, in your chapter, there's a quote, and I think it is really applicable to this conversation, specifically around this issue, but I think it's applicable to all of the cultural competency conversations we've been having recently. You said, before you jump into what you should do, pause to consider what you need to see. Step into the shoes of your people. Learn why they hold the beliefs that they do. Get to know their stories. Become adept at articulating their position, even if you disagree with it. If you can put on the various lenses of the people working with you, you'll be well poised to help them look at one another with charity and with grace. So, David, as you think about a bottom line, the floor is yours.
Well, what I love about that story is how Jesus had to go to Samaria, and he didn't really have to. That's what the text says. It wasn't like he was in a hurry. He was being intentional because he knew that there was this conversation that was going to happen, and it's with one person. So as you think about both the issues that we've talked about today and other issues in terms of how we cross culture, I'm going to ask you to consider, what is your Samaria? What is the place where you have to go? And these are the places where you're with people who are not like you. They might be people with whom you're very uncomfortable, people you don't like, or people where you have the most disagreement. What does it look like for you to be intentional to put yourself in that environment? And when you get there, who's the one person that you might engage and engage in such a way that you can build the kind of relationship and the connection that is demonstrated through Jesus and his interaction with the Samaritan woman? The hope is that we can love people like Jesus, those who are different from us, those who hold different beliefs or views from us. What does it look like for us to love them like Jesus did, like he did with the Samaritan woman? Not an affirmation or agreement. It's okay, we can disagree. And we can accept people even if we don't affirm their decisions or their choices, but we can engage with them with deep grace and truth.
I think there's a lot here, and I think that we've covered a lot of ground in this conversation, hopefully given our listeners just maybe a different framework or a different set of lenses to approach this issue than maybe they had before, that I think is helpful, and would definitely encourage people to read the chapter in your book that unpacks these things a little bit further. And I think we'll continue to pull on these threads, right? Because cultural competence does not go away. It's not becoming less and less relevant in our culture and society. And so there's definitely more threads to pull on here moving forward. So as we move on transition to our next quality of a just leader, this one will stay in the background as they all do.
For sure.
Thanks for your time today, David. It was good stuff.
Yes. Thank you, Rob.
To learn more about 1110 Leadership, visit our website at 1110leadership.com. That's the numerals 11, then spelled out TEN leadership.com. That's 11 TEN leadership.com. There you'll find more resources to equip you on the journey of becoming an 1110 leader. You can also get connected to our growing leadership network. If you've enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend. To help others find us, you can also rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts.